Sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen in the quietest moments. When we see someone we love showing kindness to a stranger, it reminds us what truly matters in this world. Snow fell softly across the village of Brundal as Jarl Stigvard returned from council, only to stop when he saw his aging mother Ingrid sitting on the old hall steps. Her head rested gently on the shoulder of a dirt-covered man with braided hair and sad eyes. It was Einar, once called the Bear of Holmvik, thought dead after vanishing during a sea raid years ago. He had returned broken in spirit, choosing to live quietly at the edges of the realm. Stigvard stormed forward, ready to send the vagabond away, but his mother looked up and said, "He kept me from falling." The Jarl looked at the forgotten warrior, and then knelt. "Then he will rise in this hall as kin." But what ancient bond connected these men, and how would one mother's kindness change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The village of Brundal had weathered countless storms, both of nature and of men, over the 3 generations since Stigvard's grandfather first claimed these lands from the wild. Nestled between rolling hills that caught the morning sun and a river that never quite froze, even in the harshest winters, it had grown from a handful of crude shelters to a prosperous settlement of 60 souls. The great hall stood at its heart, built from oak and pine that had been blessed by the old gods and reinforced by the sweat of honest labor. Stigvard walked these familiar paths every morning, as his father had done before him, and his father before that. At 35, he carried the weight of leadership with steady shoulders, though the grey threading through his brown beard reminded him that time spared no man, not even those born to rule. The carved walking stick in his hand had belonged to his grandfather, worn smooth by 3 generations of jarls who had used it not as a crutch, but as a reminder that even the mightiest oak grows from humble roots. The council meeting that morning had been like so many others. Discussions of grain stores for winter, disputes over grazing rights, plans for the spring planting. Old Björn had complained again about his neighbour's sheep wandering onto his land, while young Thorin had requested permission to marry the blacksmith's daughter. These were the concerns that filled a jarl's days in times of peace, and Stigvard had learned to find wisdom in their simplicity. His father used to say that a leader who could not settle a dispute over 3 chickens had no business commanding men in battle. But as he made his way home through the softly falling snow, his thoughts were not on chickens or sheep or marriage contracts. Instead, they drifted to his mother, Ingrid, who at 68 remained the strongest person he had ever known. She had buried her husband 5 years ago, buried 2 children who had not survived their first winters, and yet still rose each dawn to tend to anyone in the village who needed her gentle touch. She mended clothes for the poor, prepared healing brews for the sick, and somehow always knew exactly when to appear with a warm meal and a listening ear. The great hall came into view through the swirling snow, its peaked roof heavy with white, smoke rising from the central hearth to promise warmth within. But as Stigvard approached, he noticed a figure seated on the carved stone steps that led to the main entrance. It was his mother, wrapped in her thick winter cloak, the one made from wolf pelts that had been a wedding gift from his father 43 years ago. The fur was worn now in places, but still kept out the cold better than any newer garment could. What stopped him in his tracks was not the sight of his mother. She often sat on those steps to watch the village life unfold before her. It was the man beside her, leaning against her shoulder with the easy familiarity of an old friend. Despite his appearance suggesting anything but friendship with the Jarl's family, the stranger was perhaps 40 years of age, though hardship had carved lines around his eyes that might have belonged to a man 10 years older. His hair, once golden, had dulled to the color of old brass, hanging in braids that had not been properly tended in months. He wore no shirt despite the cold, his chest and arms bearing the scars that spoke of many battles fought and survived. But it was his eyes that caught Stigvard's attention, blue as a winter sky, yet holding a depth of sorrow that seemed to pull at something deep in the Jarl's memory. Those eyes belonged to a ghost, Einar Grimson, called the Bear of Holmvik, in the songs that warriors sang around evening fires, had supposedly died 3 years ago during a raid on the Orkney Islands. Stigvard remembered the day the ships had returned, how the survivors had spoken of seeing Einar fall beneath the axes of their enemies, his body lost to the hungry sea. The village had mourned him as they would any great warrior, and his name had been carved into the memorial stone that stood near the harbour. Yet here he sat, flesh and blood, and very much alive, sharing warmth with Stigvard's mother as if he belonged there. In Einar's weathered hands, Stigvard could see the broken remains of what had once been a magnificent shield. The wood was split down the middle, the metal rim bent and tarnished, the painted design that had once proclaimed Einar's lineage now faded beyond recognition. It was the shield of a defeated man, carried not out of pride, but perhaps out of some stubborn refusal to let go of what he had once been. Stigvard's first instinct was anger. This was his mother, the most precious person in his world, and here was some vagrant, living or dead, it made no difference, taking advantage of her kindness. He strode forward with the authority that had never been questioned in his own lands, ready to demand explanations and send this stranger on his way. But then his mother looked up at him with eyes that held no surprise, only a gentle sadness that made his protest die in his throat. "He kept me from falling," she said simply, and in those 5 words, Stigvard heard the echo of wisdom that had guided him through every important decision of his life. The great hall of Brundal had been built by his grandfather to impress visitors and intimidate enemies, its massive beams carved with scenes of great hunts and greater victories. But it had been his mother's presence that had made it a home. She had taught him that true strength lay not in the ability to break others, but in the capacity to lift them up when they had fallen. She had shown him that honor was not about being right, but about doing right even when, especially when, it cost something dear. Now, looking at this broken warrior who had somehow found solace in his mother's compassion, Stigvard felt the familiar tug of a choice that would define not just this moment, but the kind of man he would be remembered as. The snow continued to fall around them, each flake unique, but part of something larger, something that transformed the landscape without violence or noise. In that moment of silence, with his mother's words hanging in the cold air and a dead man sitting very much alive on his doorstep, Stigvard made a decision that his grandfather might have called foolish, that his father might have questioned, but that felt as right as anything he had ever done. He looked at Einar, really looked at him, seeing past the grime and scars to the man underneath, and then he knelt. The gesture was not one of submission, but of acknowledgement. In the old ways, when a Jarl knelt before someone, it meant he recognized their worth as equal to his own. It was a sign of respect reserved for great warriors, wise elders, and those who had earned their place through deeds rather than birth. "Then he will rise in this hall as kin," Stigvard said, and meant every word, but even as he spoke them, questions crowded his mind like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. What ancient bond connected him to this broken warrior? Why had his mother shown such ready acceptance of a man who should have been a stranger to her? And what had truly happened during that raid 3 years ago that had left a great warrior choosing exile over honor? The afternoon was growing late, and the snow showed no signs of stopping. Whatever answers lay hidden in the past, they would have to wait for the warmth of the hearth and the kind of long conversation that cold nights were made for. For now, it was enough that a man who had been lost had been found, and that sometimes the greatest victories were won not with sword and shield, but with simple human kindness. As they rose to enter the hall together, Jarl and mother and mysterious warrior, Stigvard could not shake the feeling that this moment would be remembered, long after his own name was carved in stone. Some stories, he knew, had the power to change not just those who lived them, but all who heard them told around fires yet to be lit. The great oak doors of the hall opened to welcome them all inside. and with them, whatever destiny this unexpected reunion would bring. The warmth of the great hall did little to ease the chill that had settled in Stigvard's chest as he watched Einar accept a bowl of hot stew from his mother's hands. The man ate slowly, deliberately, as if each spoonful were a gift he had not expected to receive. His fingers, Stigvard noticed, trembled slightly, not from cold, but from something deeper, something that spoke of nights spent hungry and alone. Sleep had not come easily that first night. Stigvard lay on his sleeping furs, staring at the ceiling beams his grandfather had carved with protective runes, wondering what it meant to harbor a ghost in his hall. By morning, his questions had crystallized into a single, burning need for truth. If Einar Grimson lived, then everything they had been told about that fatal raid was wrong. And if the story was wrong, then someone had lied. The village elders gathered in the small council chamber behind the great hall, their weathered faces grave as Stigvard recounted the previous day's discovery. Old Magnus, who had sailed with Stigvard's father and knew every warrior's tale worth telling, shook his head slowly. "I saw the ships return myself," Magnus said, his voice carrying the weight of remembered sorrow. 3 vessels went out, only 2 came back. Young Harold told us how Einar fell defending the retreat, how the sea took him before they could reach his body. Then either Harold lied or he was mistaken, Stigvard replied. "Because Einar Grimson sits in my hall this very moment, eating my bread and warming himself at my fire." It was then that Magnus reached into the leather pouch he always carried, the one that held the small treasures and tokens he had collected over a lifetime of travel and trade. From it, he withdrew something that made the breath catch in Stigvard's throat, a pendant carved from whalebone, its surface etched with the intricate design of the blood eagle, wings spread wide in fierce glory. "Found this washed up on our beach 2 days after the ships returned," Magnus said, placing the pendant on the oak table between them. "Recognized it as Einar's. He wore it always, said it had belonged to his grandfather. Thought it proved his death, thought the sea had given us this much back." Stigvard lifted the pendant, feeling the smooth weight of it in his palm. The carving was exquisite, the kind of work that took months to complete and was never parted with willingly. Around the eagle's claws, barely visible unless you knew to look for them, were tiny runes that spelled out words in the old tongue. "Brother's oath. Sworn in blood, sealed in honor. Brother's oath," Stigvard murmured. And suddenly, his mother's easy acceptance of the broken warrior began to make sense. His father had spoken sometimes of the oaths sworn between warriors, bonds that transcended blood and lasted beyond death. But he had been vague about the details, as if some promises were too sacred to share even with his son. That afternoon, while Einar slept the deep sleep of a man finally granted safety, Stigvard sought out his mother in her garden. Even in winter, Ingrid tended the small plot behind the hall where she grew the herbs that flavored their food and healed their wounds. She was kneeling beside a patch of hardy winter greens, her hands dark with earth, her face peaceful in a way that reminded him of the Madonna carvings the traveling priests sometimes brought from the southern lands. "You knew him," Stigvard said without preamble, settling beside her on the cold ground. "Before yesterday you knew Einar." Ingrid's hands stilled in their work, but she did not look up. "I knew of him. Your father spoke of him often, especially in his final years. Called him the brother he never had by blood, but chose by deed. What oath, mother? What bound them together?" Now she did look up, and in her eyes Stigvard saw the same deep sadness he had glimpsed in Einar's. "It was during the great storm, the year before you were born. Your father's ship was caught in the worst weather any of them had ever seen. They should have all drowned, but Einar's vessel found them in the darkness. He could have sailed on, saved his own crew without risking them for strangers. Instead, he stayed through the night, used his own ship as a windbreak while your father's men repaired their hull. That's heroic, but hardly worth a blood oath." "That wasn't the oath," Ingrid said softly. "That came later, when the storm finally broke and they could see what they had survived. Your father's ship was taking water faster than they could bail it out." Einar could have taken some of the crew, but not all. So he gave your father his word that if anything ever happened to him, to your father, Einar would watch over his family as his own. And your father swore the same. The pendant suddenly felt heavier in Stigvard's hand. He came back to honor that oath. He came back broken, and chose exile rather than bring shame to our hall. His mother corrected. I've known he was living rough in the hills for months. I've been leaving food where he could find it, mending clothes and leaving them on the rocks where he shelters. But yesterday was the first time I'd seen him face to face since the day he knelt before your father's grave and begged forgiveness for failing his oath. That evening, as the village settled into the quiet routines of winter night, Stigvard found Einar sitting alone before the great hearth. The warrior was staring into the flames with the intensity of a man seeking answers in their dance, his broken shield propped against his knees like a reminder of all he had lost. Tell me about the raid, Stigvard said. Settling onto the bench beside him, Einar was quiet for so long that Stigvard wondered if he would speak at all. When words finally came, they were soft as smoke, heavy with remembered pain. We were betrayed, he said simply. Someone told the islanders we were coming. They were ready for us, had moved their treasures and prepared an ambush. What should have been a swift strike became a massacre. Who betrayed you? I have my suspicions, but suspicions are not proof, and without proof, accusations are just the bitter words of a failed leader. Einar's fingers traced the crack in his shield. I lived when better men died. I led them into that trap and I couldn't lead them out. So you chose exile. I chose honesty. I was not worthy to stand among warriors anymore, not worthy to claim the name my grandfather had earned. Better to disappear, to let them remember the man I had been, rather than face the disappointment of seeing what I had become. Stigvard thought of his father's teachings, of the difference between wisdom and knowledge, between strength and power. My mother says you kept her from falling. For the first time since they had begun talking, Einar smiled, just a ghost of expression, but genuine. She has been keeping me from falling for months. Food left where I could find it, medicine for when the cold settled too deep in my bones, wool blankets that appeared overnight when the first snows came. I think perhaps we have been keeping each other upright. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending swirls of snow against the thick glass windows. Inside the hall, warmth and fellowship held the darkness at bay, but Stigvard could feel the weight of unfinished business pressing against his thoughts like the storm against the walls. Tomorrow, he would need to speak with Harald, the young warrior who had brought news of Einar's death. Tomorrow, he would need to decide what to do with the knowledge that someone had betrayed good men to their enemies. Tomorrow, he would need to figure out how to honor his father's oath while protecting his people from the consequences of choices made years ago. But tonight, it was enough to sit beside a man his father had called brother, sharing the warmth of a fire that had been lit by 3 generations of his family. Some truths he was learning were worth the complications they brought with them. 3 days passed before Stigvard found the courage to seek out the warhammer that had belonged to his father. It hung on the wall of his private chambers, suspended from iron hooks that had been forged by the same smith who had crafted the weapon itself. The hammer was a thing of brutal beauty, its head carved from a single piece of steel that had taken the blacksmith 6 months to perfect. Its handle made from ash wood that had been seasoned for 3 years before being deemed worthy of such a purpose. Stigvard had always felt the weight of that hammer when he looked upon it, not just the physical heft of metal and wood, but the accumulated burden of every decision his father had made while it rested at his side. Jarl Thorvald had carried it into battle 7 times, but more importantly, he had carried it to every difficult conversation. Every moment when leadership demanded more than a man wanted to give. Now, as Stigvard lifted it from its place and felt the familiar grip settle into his palm, he understood why his father had always reached for it when the hardest choices loomed. The weight reminded you that some decisions could not be made lightly. that the consequences of leadership extended far beyond the man who bore the title. The village council had gathered again that morning, but this time their discussions carried an edge of tension that had been absent from their usual deliberations about sheep and grain stores. Word of Einar's presence had spread through Brundal like smoke through dry timber, and with it had come the inevitable divisions that arose whenever the past returned to complicate the present. "He's a broken man," said Rolf the Younger, "whose father had died in a raid 5 summers past. What honor is there in harboring someone who couldn't protect his own crew? What message does that send to our young warriors?" Old Astrid, the weaver whose tapestries told the stories of 3 generations, shook her head slowly. "Honor is not something you lose in battle, boy. Honor is how you carry yourself after the battle is done. This man could have slunk away to die in shame, but instead he stayed close enough to keep his oath to our late Jarl. That speaks of character, not cowardice." "Character?" Rolf's voice rose with indignation. "He's been living like a wild animal in the hills while we thought him dead. His own people believed him lost, grieved for him, carved his name on memorial stones. And all the while he was hiding like a beaten dog rather than face the truth of his failure." Stigvard felt the hammer's weight increase as the argument continued. These were his people, men and women he had known since childhood, and they were dividing themselves over questions he had not yet answered for himself. The responsibility of leadership had never felt heavier than in this moment, when every word he spoke would determine not just Einar's fate, but the soul of his community. "My father once told me," Stigvard said quietly, and the room fell silent at his words, "that a true leader measures his worth not by the battles he wins, but by the mercy he shows when victory is within his grasp." He set the hammer on the table before him, its metal head catching the light from the oil lamps. "Einar Grimson swore an oath to my father, sealed in blood and witnessed by the gods. Whether he failed in 1 battle or 100, that oath remains sacred. But the practical concerns," Rolf began. "The practical concerns," Stigvard interrupted, his voice carrying the authority that had been passed down through 3 generations, "are mine to weigh. And I say that a man who chooses difficult honor over easy escape deserves our respect, not our condemnation." That afternoon, as the sun struggled through heavy clouds that promised more snow, Stigvard found Einar in the village workshops. The former warrior was working alongside Gunnar the carpenter, his scarred hands surprisingly gentle as he shaped a piece of pine into what would become part of a cradle for the blacksmith's pregnant wife. The work was simple but necessary, the kind of task that kept a community functioning through the dark months of winter. "Your hands remember the craft," Stigvard observed, watching Einar guide the blade of the plane along the wood's grain. "A warrior learns many skills," Einar replied, without looking up. "You cannot always rely on others to repair your weapons or build your shelters. Sometimes survival depends on what you can make with your own hands, and sometimes it depends on who stands beside you when the making becomes difficult." At this, Einar did pause in his work, setting down the plane to meet Stigvard's gaze directly. "Your people do not all welcome my presence here. I've heard the whispers, seen the looks. Some think you show weakness by harboring a failed leader. Some think many things. It is not their burden to decide what honor requires of me, and what does honor require of you, Jarl Stigvard." The question hung in the air between them, like the wood shavings that drifted down from Einar's work. Stigvard found himself thinking of his father's teachings, of the long conversations they had shared during his training for leadership. Thorvald had always insisted that honor was not a destination you reached, but a path you walked every day, with each step requiring you to choose between what was easy and what was right. "It requires me to keep the oaths my father made, even when I do not fully understand them," Stigvard said finally. "It requires me to see past the man you think you have become to the man my father knew you to be. And it requires me to trust that mercy and wisdom are not the same thing as weakness." Einar nodded slowly, then returned to his work. But as the plane bit into the wood once more, Stigvard thought he saw something different in the man's posture, not quite hope, but perhaps the absence of despair. It was a small change, but small changes, his mother had always told him, were often the seeds of great transformations. That evening, as the household settled into the comfortable rhythms of a winter night, Stigvard sat with his mother before the great hearth. She was mending one of Einar's shirts, the fabric patched in several places but clean and well cared for, while he sharpened the knife he used for hunting. The domestic peace of the moment felt precious, something to be protected against the storms, gathering both outside their walls and within their community. "You made the right choice today," Ingrid said without looking up from her needlework. "Your father would be proud of the man you are becoming. Some would say, I made the choice of a fool, not a leader. Then they understand neither leadership nor wisdom." Her fingers paused in their work. "The greatest strength your father ever showed was not in the battles he won, but in the enemies he chose not to make. Mercy, my son, is not weakness. It is the mark of a man who is strong enough to choose kindness when cruelty would be easier." Outside, the wind howled through the village streets, carrying with it the promise of a hard winter ahead. But inside the great hall of Brundal, 3 souls had found something worth protecting against the cold. Not just warmth, but the possibility that broken things could be mended, that lost things could be found, and that sometimes the most important battles were the ones fought not with hammers and shields, but with patience and understanding. The weight of the war hammer would always be there, reminding Stigvard of the responsibilities he carried. But tonight, surrounded by his family and the man his father had called brother, that weight felt less like a burden and more like an anchor, something that kept him steady when the storms of leadership threatened to sweep him away from his true course. The discovery came by accident, as most revelations do. Einar had been helping young Tormund repair a broken cartwheel when his leather satchel, the only possession he had carried with him from his years of exile, tipped over, spilling its meager contents onto the workshop floor. Among the few items scattered there, a worn whetstone, strips of dried meat wrapped in oiled cloth, a small pouch of healing herbs, lay something that made Stigvard's breath catch in his throat. It was a stone, no larger than a man's fist, but carved with runes so ancient that few living souls could still read their meaning. The surface had been polished smooth by countless hands over generations, and the deep grooves of the carved symbols had been filled with silver to make them stand out against the dark granite. This was an oath stone, the kind used in the most sacred ceremonies, when warriors bound themselves not just in word, but in blood and soul. Stigvard knelt to retrieve it, feeling the weight of history in his hands, as he traced the silver-filled runes with his fingertip. His father had taught him the old writing when he was a boy, insisting that a leader must understand the words of his ancestors if he hoped to guide his people wisely. These symbols told a story. 2 names carved side by side, surrounded by the intricate knotwork that bound them together for all time. "Thorvald Eriksson," he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "Einar Grimson," and below their names, in runes so small they were almost invisible, brothers in spirit, guardians of blood, sworn to protect what the other holds most dear. Einar's face had gone pale as winter ice. "I should have left that buried with the rest of my past. Why didn't you?" The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Einar looked at the stone in Stigvard's hands, and for a moment his carefully maintained composure cracked, revealing the depth of pain he had carried alone for so long. "Because it was the only proof I had left that I was once worthy of such an oath," Einar said finally. "When everything else was stripped away, my reputation, my courage, my right to call myself a warrior, that stone remained. It reminded me that once, at least, I had been someone worth trusting with another man's most precious treasures." Stigvard turned the stone over in his hands, feeling the smoothness of countless rituals, the weight of promises made and kept across generations. "Tell me about the oath ceremony. I want to know exactly what my father swore to you and what you swore to him. They walked together to the hill, overlooking the village, where the memorial stone stood in silent witness to the dead. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered ground, and the air carried the crisp clarity that comes only in the depths of winter. Here, away from the daily concerns of the settlement, they could speak of sacred things without interruption. It was after the storm, Einar began, settling onto a fallen log that served as a natural bench. We had saved each other's lives, but more than that, we had seen into each other's hearts during those dark hours when death seemed certain. Your father was young then, newly married to your mother, with responsibilities that weighed heavily on his shoulders. I was unmarried still, but I understood the burden of leadership. The fear that those you love might suffer for your failures, so you swore to protect each other's families. More than that, Einar took the oath stone from Stigvard's hands, holding it as if it were made of spun glass rather than granite. We swore that if either of us fell in battle, the survivor would take the other's family as his own, not as servants or dependents, but as bloodkin. Your father's children would become my children, his wife my sister, his honor my honor to protect or restore. The implications of such an oath struck Stigvard like a physical blow. You've been watching over us all these years. Even in exile, even when you thought yourself unworthy, you stayed close enough to honor that promise. I tried to honor it. When your father sickened and died, I should have been here. I should have stood at his funeral and sworn my continued protection to you and your mother. Instead, I was rotting in the hills like a coward, too ashamed to show my face in the hall where we had sworn our brotherhood. But you came back eventually. You knelt at his grave. Einar's grip tightened on the oath stone. I came back when I heard that your mother had taken a fever, when the traveling merchants spoke of the Jarl's family being in need. I thought perhaps I could help without being seen, leave medicines or food where she might find them. But when I saw her that day, weeping alone at your father's gravestone, I couldn't remain hidden any longer. What did you say to her? I asked her forgiveness for my failure. I told her that I had sworn to protect her family, and instead had brought shame upon the memory of her husband. I offered to leave forever if my presence caused her pain. Stigvard could picture the scene, his proud mother, so recently widowed, faced with the broken warrior who had once been her husband's closest friend. And what did she say? She said that grief shared was lighter than grief carried alone. She said that your father had spoken of me often in his final years, that he worried more about my fate than his own failing health. She said that oaths sworn in love do not end with death, they simply take new forms. The sun was setting now, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and crimson. From their vantage point on the hill, they could see the smoke rising from the chimneys of Brundal, could hear the distant sounds of evening chores being completed and families gathering for their evening meals. It was a scene of peaceful prosperity, the kind of life that men fought and died to protect. My mother's health, Stigvard said carefully. Has it been troubling her much lately? Einar's expression darkened. More than she admits to you, I think. The fever comes and goes, never quite breaking, but never fully leaving her either. I've brought her what healing herbs I could find in the wild places, but they do little good. She needs the attention of a real healer, someone with knowledge of the southern medicines. The nearest healer is 3 days' ride south, in Jarl Henrik's lands. Then perhaps it is time for me to earn my place at your table. I know the roads to Henrik's settlement, know which paths remain passable, even in deep winter. If your mother needs healing that cannot be found in Brundal, then I will find it for her, oath or no oath. As they walked back down the hill toward the warmth and light of the village, Stigvard felt the weight of destiny settling around them like the gathering dusk. The oath stone in his pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, as if the promises carved into its surface were awakening after years of dormancy. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever tests would come to prove the strength of bonds, forged in brotherhood and tempered by loss, he knew now that they would not face them alone. The messenger arrived at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat despite the bitter cold. his face grim with the kind of news that turns peaceful mornings into days of reckoning. Stigvard met him at the gates of the settlement, still pulling on his winter cloak, the war hammer heavy at his side, as it always was when strangers brought word from distant lands. Jarl Stigvard, the young rider gasped, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. I ride from the eastern settlements. Jarl Gunnar the Red gathers his warband. He claims your lands by right of conquest, says your people grow weak with prosperity and need stronger leadership. The words hit like a physical blow. Gunnar the Red was known throughout the region as a man who took what he wanted and justified it later with whatever excuse proved convenient. His settlement lay 2 days' hard riding to the east, in lands that were rich in iron, but poor in the kind of fertile soil that made Brundal prosperous. For years, there had been tension between their peoples, but it had never escalated beyond harsh words and trade disputes. What right does he claim? Stigvard asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. He says, your father owed him tribute from the raid on the Irish monastery 5 years past. Says the debt passes to you with your inheritance, and if you cannot pay in silver, he will take it in land and livestock. Stigvard felt his jaw clench. The raid in question had been a joint venture, with both settlements providing ships and men for an expedition that had yielded enough treasure to make everyone wealthy. But Gunnar had always been the type to remember only what others owed him, never what he owed in return. How many men rides with him? 50, perhaps 60, well-armed and eager for battle. They speak of taking your lands before the spring thaw, when travel becomes easier for any who might come to your aid. Inside the great hall, word of the threat spread quickly among the villagers who had gathered for the morning meal. Stigvard could see the fear in their faces, the way mothers pulled their children closer and men instinctively reached for weapons that had not been used for anything more dangerous than hunting in years. These were good people, prosperous and content, but they were not warriors. In a direct confrontation with Gunnar's battle-hardened raiders, they would be slaughtered. It was then that Einar stepped forward, and Stigvard saw something in the broken warrior's eyes that had been absent since his return, a spark of the man he had once been, the strategist who had earned his reputation through cunning as much as courage. How defensible is this settlement? Einar asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to planning for war. We have the river to the south, the hills to the north, Stigvard replied. The approaches are limited, but we lack the men to guard them properly. Numbers can be overcome with proper tactics. What weapons do your people have? As they spoke, Einar began to pace the length of the hall, his mind clearly working through possibilities and problems with the kind of rapid calculation that marked a natural military leader. Watching him, Stigvard began to understand why his father had valued this man's friendship so highly. Beneath the scars and self-doubt, the strategic genius that had made Einar famous was still intact. There's something else, Magnus the Elder said quietly, approaching with a leather satchel clutched in his weathered hands. Something I should have shown you years ago when your father died, but the time never seemed right, and then Einar's return made me wonder if the old stories were true. From the satchel, he withdrew a silver arm ring, its surface twisted into an intricate pattern that spoke of master craftsmanship. The metal gleamed in the firelight, and along its length were carved runes that made Stigvard's blood run cold. This was not the simple arm ring of a warrior or even a wealthy merchant. This was the kind of treasure worn only by royalty, by those born to rule, rather than those who earned their authority through strength alone. Where did you get this? Einar's voice was barely a whisper, his face pale as fresh snow. Your mother brought it to me, the day you sailed for the Orkney Islands, Magnus replied. Said if you never returned, I was to give it to whichever leader proved worthy of knowing your true heritage. Said it would explain everything if the time came when explanations were needed. Stigvard took the arm ring, feeling its weight and examining the runes carved along its length. What he read there changed everything he thought he knew about the man his father had called brother. The symbols spelled out a lineage that traced back through 5 generations of Jarls, a bloodline that made Einar not just a warrior, but rightful heir to lands that stretched far beyond the borders of any single settlement. "You're not just Einar Grimson," Stigvard said slowly, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "You're Einar Eriksson, son of Jarl Erik the Bold, rightful ruler of the eastern fjords." "Was," Einar corrected, but his voice lacked conviction. "That man died with his crew in the waters off the Orkney Islands." "No," Stigvard said firmly, holding up the silver arm ring so that its runes caught the light. "That man has been hiding from his destiny, but his blood remains royal, his claim remains valid. And if Gunnar the Red thinks he can take these lands by force, perhaps it's time he learned that he's not the only one who can call upon ancient rights and bloodline claims." The implications of the revelation rippled through the assembled villagers like stones thrown into still water. Here was not just a broken warrior seeking redemption, but a legitimate ruler whose very existence challenged the authority of those who would threaten their peaceful settlement. The balance of power in the region had shifted in an instant, though whether for better or worse remained to be seen. Einar stared at the arm ring as if it were a serpent that might strike at any moment. "I gave up that claim when I failed my people. I have no right to wear the symbols of royal blood. Rights are not surrendered." Ingrid's voice carried clearly across the hall as she emerged from the shadows where she had been listening. "They are abdicated or upheld. And I say that the man who kept faith with his oaths, even in his darkest hour, has earned the right to reclaim what was always his." Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, dark and pregnant with snow that would soon blanket the land in white. But inside the great hall of Brundal, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that would test not just their ability to defend their homes, but their understanding of honor, loyalty, and what it truly meant to be worthy of the power to rule over others. The silver arm ring lay on the oak table between them, gleaming with possibility and heavy with the weight of destiny. Soon, they would all learn whether the bonds forged in friendship and tempered by adversity were strong enough to withstand the coming tempest. The raven banner had once flown proudly above the great hall of the eastern fjords, its black wings spread wide against a field of deep blue, the ancient symbol of Einar's bloodline. Now it lay folded in the bottom of his traveling pack, the fabric faded and torn, stained with salt spray and the memory of defeat. He had carried it through 3 years of exile, not out of pride, but as penance, a reminder of the honor he had lost and the people he had failed to protect. Magnus had found it while helping to organize the village's meager weapons, and now it lay spread across the great table like a battle plan, written in thread and dye. The sight of it seemed to pain Einar more than his physical scars, but Stigvard could see the way the man's fingers traced its edges with reverent care, as if touching something sacred that he no longer deserved to hold. "Your grandfather's banner," Magnus said quietly. "Erik the Bold carried this into 17 battles and never once saw it touch the ground in defeat." "Then perhaps it should remain folded," Einar replied, but there was uncertainty in his voice now, a crack in the armor of self-recrimination he had worn for so long. The morning brought troubling news from the eastern borders. Young Olaf, who tended the sheep in the high pastures, had seen smoke on the horizon, not the thin wisps of hearth fires, but the thick black columns that spoke of burning buildings. The scouts Stigvard had sent out at dawn returned with grim faces and worse news. 3 farms burned, reported Thorkel, the best tracker in the settlement. The families escaped to the hills, but their livestock are gone and their grain stores destroyed. Gunnar's men are moving closer, burning as they come. How long before they reach us? Stigvard asked, though he dreaded the answer. 2 days, perhaps 3 if this snow continues to fall. They're not trying to hide their approach. They want us to see the smoke, want us to know what's coming. It was a classic tactic, one designed to break the spirit of defenders before the first blow was struck. Stigvard had read about such strategies in the old sagas, but experiencing them firsthand was different from hearing stories around a fire. The weight of responsibility for every life in Brundal pressed down on him like a physical burden. That afternoon, as the snow continued to fall in thick curtains that muffled sound and reduced visibility to mere paces, Einar began the work that would either save them or doom them all. He moved through the village like a man possessed, studying every building, every path, every potential advantage or weakness, with the eye of someone who had learned warfare from masters of the craft. "The river is our greatest asset," he explained to Stigvard as they stood on the wooden bridge that connected the main settlement to the farmlands beyond. "It's too wide to ford easily, and the current is still strong enough to sweep away a man in armor. But it's also our greatest weakness if they find a way across upstream. What do you suggest? We abandon the outlying buildings, pull everyone back to the Great Hall and the structures closest to it. Create a defensive perimeter that we can actually hold with the men we have." Einar pointed to the various buildings scattered throughout the settlement. "We can't defend everything, so we defend what matters most, the people." As they planned, villagers began the grim work of preparing for siege. Women and children were moved to the most secure buildings, while men who had never held anything more dangerous than farming tools learned to grip spears and shields. The blacksmith worked through the night, turning plowshares into spear points and horseshoes into arrowheads. Even the elderly contributed, sharing stories of sieges they had survived in their youth, offering wisdom born of experience and fear. But it was Ingrid's condition that worried Stigvard most. The fever that had been coming and going for weeks seemed to be gaining strength, leaving her pale and weak despite her efforts to hide her illness. She insisted on helping with the preparations, organizing food stores and medical supplies. But Einar had caught her leaning against a wall twice that day. Her breathing labored, and her skin damp with perspiration. "She needs rest," Einar said quietly, as they watched her direct the younger women in preparing bandages from torn cloth. "This fever is not natural. It follows no pattern I've seen before." "You think she's been poisoned?" "I think someone wants your family weakened when the attack comes. Your mother is the heart of this community. Without her strength and wisdom to steady them, your people will be easier to break." The implications hit Stigvard like a physical blow. If someone had been slowly poisoning his mother, it meant the threat was not just external. Someone within their own settlement was working with Gunnar, someone who had access to Ingrid's food or drink. Someone she trusted enough to let close. That evening, as the household gathered for what might be their last peaceful meal together, Stigvard found himself studying every face around the table. These were people he had known his entire life, men and women who had celebrated his birth and mourned his father's death. The idea that one of them might be a traitor was almost too painful to contemplate. "We need to know who we can trust," he said to Einar as they sat before the great hearth after the others had retired. "If there's a viper in our midst, they'll strike when we're most vulnerable." Einar nodded, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "I've been thinking the same thing. Someone told Gunnar about your father's supposed debt, information that should have been private between Jarls. Someone knows exactly when to strike, when your defenses will be weakest. Any ideas who? I have suspicions, but like my thoughts about the original betrayal, suspicions are not proof." Einar lifted the tattered raven banner from where it lay beside his chair, holding it up to catch the firelight. "But perhaps it's time to stop living in the shadows of past failures. Perhaps it's time to remind people that some bloodlines carry more than just noble heritage. They carry the knowledge of how to fight and win against impossible odds." Outside, the wind howled through the village streets, carrying with it the scent of distant fires and the promise of battles yet to come. But inside the great hall, two leaders, one born to rule, one thrust into command by circumstances, began to weave the kind of alliance that had once turned the tide of kingdoms. The raven banner stirred in the firelight as if moved by invisible wings, and for the first time in years, Einar Eriksson began to remember what it felt like to fly. The poisoned chalice was discovered purely by chance, hidden beneath loose stones in the cellar where the household stores were kept. Astrid the weaver had gone to retrieve preserved meat for the evening meal, when her foot caught on a stone that shifted under her weight. Beneath it, wrapped in oiled leather, lay an ornate drinking horn carved from walrus ivory and inlaid with silver wire that caught the torchlight, like captured stars. But it was not the beauty of the craftsmanship that made Stigvard's blood run cold when Astrid brought it to him. It was the smell that rose from within, sweet and cloying, with an undertone of bitter almonds that spoke of slow death administered drop by careful drop. He had smelled that scent before years ago, when a traveling merchant had tried to poison a rival by adding extract of wolfsbane to his mead. "This belongs to Harold," Einar said quietly, recognizing the distinctive carving style. "I've seen him drink from it many times during feasts and celebrations. Harold the Young, the warrior who had brought news of Einar's supposed death 3 years ago. Harold, who had access to the Great Hall, who was trusted by everyone in the settlement, who could easily have been adding small amounts of poison to Ingrid's food or drink over the course of weeks, without anyone suspecting." The revelation hit like a physical blow, but even as Stigvard reeled from the betrayal, pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place. "He's been planning this for a long time," Stigvard said, his voice tight with controlled rage. "The raid on the Orkney Islands. You said someone betrayed your position to the enemy." "Harold was on that raid," Einar confirmed, his own voice deadly calm. "He was one of the few who knew our exact route and timing. I had wondered how the islanders could have prepared such a perfect ambush. But why? What does he gain from betraying his own people?" The answer came not from Einar, but from Magnus the Elder, whose face had gone pale as ancient parchment. "Power," the old man whispered. "Harold's grandfather was Jarl of these lands before your great-grandfather took them in battle 40 years ago. The bloodline claim was never formally settled. Your family ruled by right of conquest. But Harold's family never stopped believing they were the rightful heirs. The implications crashed over Stigvard like storm waves against a rocky shore. Harold had not been working alone. He had been part of a conspiracy that stretched back decades, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what his family believed was stolen from them. The raid on the Orkney Islands had been meant to eliminate Einar, whose military genius and loyalty to Stigvard's father made him dangerous to their plans. When that had failed and Einar had instead chosen exile, Harold had bided his time, slowly poisoning the Jarl's family while making arrangements with outside enemies who could provide the military force needed to take control. "Gunnar the Red," Einar said, following the same thread of logic. "Harold must have promised him a share of the spoils in exchange for his support. Probably told him about the weakness in our defenses, about how prosperous the settlement has become, and about my mother's illness, making it harder for me to lead effectively," Stigvard added bitterly. "He's been weakening us from within while arranging for our destruction from without." But even as they spoke, Stigvard realized that Harold was nowhere to be found. The young warrior had volunteered for the morning patrol and had not yet returned, despite the fact that the other scouts had been back for hours. A cold certainty settled in Stigvard's stomach. Harold was not coming back. He was already with Gunnar's forces, probably guiding them along the safest routes to the settlement, sharing intelligence about the defensive preparations that Einar had been making. "We need to assume he's told them everything," Einar said grimly. "Every plan we've made, every preparation we've taken, they'll know about it all." "Then we change the plans," Stigvard replied, but even as he said it, he wondered if they had time. Gunnar's forces could be at their gates within hours, and here they were, forced to start their defensive planning all over again. It was then that Ingrid spoke from the doorway, where she had been standing, unnoticed in the shadows. Despite her illness, her voice carried the clear authority that had made her the unofficial leader of the settlement's women for more than 20 years. "Not everything," she said quietly. "Harold knows about the defenses you've been planning, but he doesn't know about the old passages." "What old passages?" Stigvard asked, though something deep in his memory stirred. Childhood games of hide and seek. His mother's gentle warnings about staying away from certain areas of the settlement. Your grandfather was not just a warrior. He was also a man who believed in being prepared for the worst, Ingrid explained, moving carefully to join them around the table. When he built this settlement, he included escape routes and hidden supply caches that only the Jarl's family was supposed to know about. I showed them to your father when we were first married, and he made me promise to keep the secret until you were old enough to need such knowledge. She led them to what appeared to be a solid stone wall in the deepest part of the cellar. But when she pressed against a particular stone, in a sequence that had been memorized across generations, a section of the wall swung inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a tunnel that disappeared into darkness. There are 3 of these, she explained, lighting a torch to illuminate the passage. One leads to the hills behind the settlement, one comes up near the river crossing, and the third connects to the old watchtower that was abandoned when your grandfather expanded the main hall. They were designed so that if the settlement was ever overrun, the Jarl's family could escape and coordinate a counterattack from positions the enemy didn't know about. Einar studied the tunnel with the eye of a military strategist, and Stigvard could see the wheels turning in his mind. This changes everything, he said slowly. If we can position men in these hidden locations, we can turn Gunnar's superior numbers against him, make him think he's winning while we strike from directions he never expected. But we'll need warriors willing to take that risk, Stigvard pointed out. Men brave enough to hide in tunnels while their families are under attack, trusting that the plan will work. Then we tell them the truth, Einar said firmly. We tell them about Harald's betrayal, about how long this conspiracy has been in motion, about what will happen to their wives and children if Gunnar takes control of this settlement. And then we give them the chance to strike back at the people who have been playing them for fools. As they made their plans in the flickering torchlight, Stigvard felt a grim satisfaction settling over him. Harald had thought himself clever, had believed that years of careful manipulation and secret alliances would guarantee his victory. But the young traitor had made one crucial mistake. He had underestimated the bonds that held this community together, and he had forgotten that sometimes the greatest advantages come not from what your enemies know, but from what they think they know. The poisoned chalice sat on the table above them, its ivory surface gleaming with malice and broken promises. But below ground, in tunnels carved by foresight and defended by loyalty, a different kind of poison was being prepared, one that would prove far more deadly to those who had chosen treachery over honor. Tomorrow would bring battle, blood, and the final reckoning for choices made in darkness and secrets kept too long. But tonight, in the hidden places beneath Brundal, justice was sharpening its blade and preparing to strike from the shadows where betrayal thought it could hide forever. The ancestral sword had not been drawn from its scabbard in 5 years, not since the day it had been used to cut the funeral pyre rope that sent Jarl Thorvald to his rest among the honored dead. Now it lay across Stigvard's knees as he sat in the great hall during the hours before dawn, its blade reflecting the dying embers of the hearth fire like captured starlight. The weapon was older than memory, passed down through 7 generations of his bloodline. Its steel folded and refolded by master smiths until it could cut through chain mail as easily as silk. But tonight, its significance went beyond mere warfare. As Einar knelt before him in the ancient ceremony that would make them blood brothers in truth, rather than just in spirit, the sword became the instrument through which oaths would be sworn and destinies bound together. The ritual was older than Christianity, older than the written word, dating back to the time when warriors believed that sharing blood could bind souls across the boundaries of life and death. Do you, Einar Eriksson, son of Eric the Bold, rightful Jarl of the Eastern Fjords, swear by your blood and by your honor to stand as brother to Stigvard Thorvaldsson? The words came from Magnus the Elder, who alone among them remembered the full ceremony from his own youth. I swear it, Einar replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. He held out his left hand, palm upward. As tradition demanded, The blade was sharp enough that Stigvard barely felt it part the skin of his own palm before he drew it across Einar's hand in the ritual cut that would mingle their blood. They clasped hands then, letting their mingled blood drip onto the ancestral sword's blade, sealing the oath in the old way that made it binding, not just in this life but in whatever came after. Then rise, Einar Eriksson, blood brother to the Jarl of Brundal, and take up the banner of your fathers. Let any who would harm this family know that they face not one bloodline, but two, united in common cause. The raven banner had been cleaned and mended during the night by the women of the settlement. Its black wings spread wide once more against the field of deep blue that had flown over victorious battlefields for 3 generations. As Einar lifted it from the table where it had been laid out in preparation, Stigvard saw something in the man's bearing that had been absent since his return. Not just the memory of nobility, but its living embodiment. Around them, the great hall filled with the people of Brundal as word of the ceremony spread through the settlement. They came not as subjects watching their lord perform some arcane ritual, but as a community witnessing the forging of the alliance that might save their lives. Children pressed close to their mothers, wide-eyed with wonder at the ancient words and older customs. Elder men nodded approvingly, remembering their own youth when such ceremonies were more common. Even those who had questioned Einar's presence now seemed to understand that something larger than their individual doubts was taking place. "My people," Stigvard said, rising to address the assembled villagers, the ancestral sword still bloody in his hand. "Today, we face enemies who believe our prosperity makes us weak, who think our peace makes us helpless. They are wrong on both counts. Prosperity gives us something worth defending, and peace gives us the wisdom to defend it well." He gestured to Einar, who stood with the raven banner draped across his shoulders like a royal cloak. "This man was thought dead, but he lives. He was believed broken, but he stands whole. He was called failure, but today he leads us to victory. Let our enemies learn what it means to face not just the Bear of Brundal, but the raven of the eastern fjords flying beside him." The cheer that rose from the gathered villagers was not the polite applause of subjects acknowledging their lord's words, but the fierce battle cry of people who had found their courage in the darkest hour. Men who had never held weapons beyond farming tools gripped their makeshift spears with new confidence. Women, who had been weeping for their children's safety, now stood with the grim determination of mothers preparing to defend their young. Even the elderly, too frail to fight but too proud to cower, began sharpening kitchen knives and preparing the kind of surprises that would make any invader regret underestimating the will of free people. As the ceremony concluded and the villagers dispersed to their final preparations, Stigvard found himself alone with his mother in the quiet corner of the hall where she had set up her healing station. Her fever had broken during the night, whether from the removal of the poisoned chalice's influence or from sheer determination. He could not say, but her strength was returning just when it was needed. "I should have seen Harold's treachery sooner," she said quietly as she prepared bandages and healing salves for the wounded they expected to tend before the day was done. "I trusted him because he was young when your father died, barely more than a boy trying to prove himself worthy of warrior status. I thought his occasional questions about family history and settlement defenses came from innocent curiosity." "We all trusted him," Stigvard replied. "That's what makes betrayal so effective. It comes from those we have no reason to suspect. But you suspected someone was helping our enemies. Your instincts were right, even if you couldn't identify the threat precisely." She paused in her work to look at him with the kind of maternal pride that had sustained him through every challenge of his life. "Your father would be proud of the man you've become and of the choices you've made. Bringing Einar back into our family, that took the kind of courage that can't be taught, only lived." Outside the hall, the sounds of final preparation echoed through the settlement. The blacksmith's hammer rang against steel as he made last-minute repairs to weapons and armor. Children's voices could be heard as they were led to the most secure buildings, their mothers singing old lullabies to keep them calm, despite the tension that filled the air like smoke from a distant fire. The men who would fight gathered in small groups, sharing what knowledge they had of weapons and warfare, helping each other adjust unfamiliar armor and practice basic sword strokes. Einar moved among them like a master teacher, offering guidance born of hard experience and genuine care for their survival. He showed the farmers how to hold their shields to deflect rather than absorb the force of enemy blows. He taught the younger men the importance of staying in formation, how individual heroics could doom an entire defense line. Most importantly, he gave them the kind of confidence that comes from knowing their leader understood not just the theory of battle, but its brutal reality. "The secret passages are ready," he reported when he returned to the hall. "I positioned our best men at the tunnel exits. They'll wait for Gunnar's forces to commit to the main assault before striking from behind. The oil pots are in place along the eastern approach, ready to be lit if the enemy tries to use fire as a weapon. And the river crossing has been prepared with the kind of surprise that will turn their strength against them." What about Harold? Any sign of him with Gunnar's forces? No direct sighting, but the scouts report movement that suggests someone is guiding them along paths that avoid our outer defenses. They're coming exactly as we feared, with knowledge of our weaknesses and confidence in their superiority. Einar's expression was grim but determined. But they don't know about the changes we've made. And they certainly don't expect to face a coordinated defense led by someone who understands their tactics. As the morning sun struggled through heavy clouds that promised more snow, Stigvard felt the familiar weight of leadership settle around him like armor. But it was a different kind of burden now, not the lonely responsibility of a ruler standing apart from his people, but the shared duty of a leader standing among warriors who had chosen to follow him not out of obligation, but out of trust earned through honest action. The ancestral sword hung at his side, its blade cleaned of the blood from the morning ceremony, but still warm with the memory of oaths sworn and destinies joined. Beside him stood Einar, no longer the broken exile seeking redemption, but the rightful Jarl who had remembered what it meant to lead with both courage and wisdom. Between them, they carried not just the hopes of one settlement, but the promise that honor could triumph over treachery, that brotherhood could overcome betrayal, and that sometimes the greatest victories were won not by the strongest warriors, but by those who had learned to fight for something greater than themselves. The battle would begin soon, bringing with it pain and loss that no victory could fully heal. But as Stigvard looked around the great hall at the faces of people who had become more than subjects, who had become family worth dying for, he knew that whatever the outcome, they would meet their fate with the kind of dignity that made defeat itself a form of victory. Outside, the wind carried the sound of approaching hoofbeats and the distant gleam of weapons catching the pale morning light. The time for preparation was ending, and the time for proving their worth was about to begin. The war horn's voice echoed across the snow-covered settlement like the cry of some ancient beast awakening from slumber. Its deep, resonant tone had not been heard in Brundal for 7 years, not since the last time enemies had dared to threaten the peace that Stigvard's father had built with blood and wisdom. Now it sang again, calling defenders to their positions as the sun climbed slowly through clouds heavy with the promise of more snow. From the great hall's highest window, Stigvard could see Gunnar's forces approaching across the white fields like a dark stain spreading across clean cloth. 60 men, just as the messenger had reported, but they moved with the confidence of warriors who believed victory was already assured. At their head rode Gunnar the Red himself, his crimson cloak bright against the winter landscape, his war axe gleaming even in the pale morning light, and there, riding at Gunnar's right hand as an honored advisor, was Harold the Young. The traitor's presence confirmed everything they had suspected about the conspiracy, but it also provided a cold satisfaction when the battle was done and justice needed to be dispensed. Harold would be within reach of the justice he had so richly earned. "Signal the tunnel positions," Stigvard commanded, and Magnus the Elder raised the banner that would tell their hidden forces to prepare for the coordinated strike that would turn this apparent siege into something far different. Einar stood beside him, the raven banner of his bloodline flowing from a staff planted firmly in the hall's main doorway. The sight of it had visible impact on Gunnar's approaching forces. Men began pointing and speaking in hushed tones as they recognized the symbol of a royal house they had thought extinct. Harold's face, even at this distance, was pale with shock. Whatever he had told Gunnar about the expected resistance, it had not included facing a legitimate rival claimant to regional authority. "He doesn't know I'm alive," Einar observed with grim satisfaction. "Harold thought his betrayal had killed me 3 years ago. Seeing the raven banner flying again must feel like facing a ghost returned for vengeance." The first clash came at the river crossing, exactly as Einar had predicted. Gunnar's forces approached the wooden bridge with the swagger of men who believed they faced frightened farmers rather than prepared warriors. They had no way of knowing about the careful modifications made during the night. The support beams weakened just enough. The planking loosened in specific patterns, the oil-soaked ropes ready to drop the entire structure into the rushing water below. Thorkel the tracker, positioned in the abandoned watchtower with a clear view of the crossing, waited until exactly half of Gunnar's warband was on the bridge before signaling the attack. The war horn sounded again, but this time its call was answered by the crash of splintering wood and the shouts of men suddenly finding themselves waist-deep in icy water with their heavy armor dragging them toward the riverbed. "Now," Stigvard commanded, and 20 defenders emerged from the concealed positions along the riverbank. These were not seasoned warriors, but they had the advantage of preparation and the desperate courage of men defending their families. Their spears found targets among the struggling figures in the water, while their arrows struck down those few who managed to reach the far bank. But Gunnar the Red had not earned his reputation through stupidity. Instead of trying to force the river crossing, he pulled his remaining forces back and began to circle toward the eastern approach where the terrain favored attackers. It was exactly the movement Einar had anticipated, the reason they had prepared their most sophisticated trap along that route. "Let them come," Einar said quietly, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Harold has told Gunnar about our defenses, but he doesn't know we've been expecting him to tell. Every piece of intelligence he's provided has been turned against him. The eastern approach led through a narrow valley between 2 low hills, a natural funnel that would concentrate Gunnar's forces exactly where the defenders needed them. What the attackers could not see from their position was the network of tripwires connected to carefully balanced logs, the hidden pits covered with snow-dusted canvas, and most importantly, the oil-filled trenches that could be ignited to turn the entire valley into a corridor of flame. As Gunnar's forces entered the killing ground, Stigvard felt the weight of command settling around him like armor forged from responsibility and tempered by necessity. These next few minutes would determine not just the fate of Brundal, but the kind of leader he would prove himself to be under the ultimate test. Beside him, Einar radiated the calm confidence of a man who had found his purpose again after years of doubt and self-recrimination. The trap was set, the pieces were in motion, and the first phase of the battle was about to begin in earnest. Whatever happened next would write itself in blood and memory, creating the kind of story that would be told around fires for generations to come. The dragon's tooth dagger had been a gift from Harold's grandfather to mark his 16th birthday. Its blade carved from a single piece of walrus ivory and inlaid with silver runes that promised victory to those who carried it with honor. Now it gleamed with malice in Harold's hand as he faced Einar across the blood-soaked snow of the eastern valley. Both men breathing hard from the battle that had brought them to this moment of final reckoning. The trap had worked perfectly, too perfectly perhaps. Gunnar's forces had charged into the narrow valley with the confidence of warriors who believed they knew every danger that awaited them. The hidden pits had claimed 6 men, the oil trenches another 8, when Stigvard's archers lit them with fire arrows that turned the entire approach into a corridor of flame. But it was the coordinated assault from the secret tunnels that had truly broken their advance, striking from positions that Harald's intelligence had never mentioned, because Harald himself had never known they existed. Now Gunnar the Red lay dead in the snow, felled by one of Stigvard's spears as the false Jarl tried to rally his remaining men for a final charge. The battle should have been over, but Harald had proven too proud to surrender, too consumed by generations of inherited hatred to accept defeat with any grace. Instead, he had sought out Einar for single combat, believing that killing the rightful heir to the eastern fjords would somehow validate his family's ancient claims. "You should have stayed dead," Harald snarled, circling warily as they faced each other in the center of the valley. Around them, the last of Gunnar's forces were either surrendering to Stigvard's men or fleeing toward the horizon with the kind of desperate speed that comes when a sure victory transforms into utter defeat. 3 years I've planned for this moment. 3 years of careful preparation to claim what my bloodline deserves. Your bloodline lost its claim when your grandfather chose treachery over honor, Einar replied, his own sword steady in his grip despite the exhaustion that weighed down his limbs like chains. What you deserve and what you've earned are 2 very different things. The dagger struck like a serpent, faster than Einar had expected from a man who had always seemed more politician than warrior. Only his instinctive dodge saved him from a thrust that would have opened his throat. And even so, the ivory blade left a thin line of blood along his jaw as it passed. Harald was better trained than he had pretended, more dangerous than anyone had suspected. But Einar had spent 3 years fighting for survival in conditions that would have broken weaker men, and the muscles that had grown soft during his time as a celebrated war leader had been hardened again by constant struggle against cold, hunger, and despair. When Harald's next attack came, Einar was ready for it. The clash of steel against ivory rang out across the valley like a bell tolling for the dead. Harald fought with the desperate fury of a man who had staked everything on this moment and could not afford to lose. His dagger work was intricate, precise, the product of expensive training by masters who had taught him to kill with elegant efficiency. But Einar fought with the grim determination of someone who had already lost everything once and refused to let it happen again. Meanwhile, on the slope overlooking the valley, Stigvard faced his own test of leadership as he coordinated the final phases of the battle. The victory was assured now. Gunnar's remaining forces were scattered and demoralized, but the work of being a leader continued even after the fighting stopped. Wounded men needed tending, prisoners required guarding, and the delicate business of turning enemies into neighbors would need to begin before the blood was even dry on the snow. "Bring the surviving captives to the hall," he commanded. "They'll be given food and shelter while we decide their fate. Any man who fought for Gunnar out of loyalty rather than greed deserves the chance to prove his worth under better leadership." It was the kind of mercy his father would have shown, the sort of wisdom that turned military victories into lasting peace. But even as he gave the orders, Stigvard's attention remained fixed on the personal combat taking place below. Einar was holding his own, but Harald was proving more formidable than expected, and the outcome of their duel would determine more than just their individual fates. In the valley, Einar finally found his opening when Harald overextended himself on a particularly ambitious thrust. The ivory dagger passed harmlessly through empty air as Einar sidestepped and brought his sword around in the kind of controlled strike that spoke of years of training and natural talent working in perfect harmony. The blade took Harald just below the ribs, angled upward to find the heart that had harbored so much hatred for so long. as the traitor fell to his knees in the blood-stained snow, his eyes wide with the shock of a man who had never truly believed he could lose. Einar spoke the words that would be remembered long after the wounds of this battle had healed. Your grandfather's shame dies with you. Let that be enough. The dragon's toothed dagger fell from nerveless fingers to lie beside its owner in the snow, its silver inlays catching the pale sunlight like tears shed for opportunities wasted and honor betrayed. The valley fell silent except for the wind and the distant sounds of men beginning. The long work of cleaning up after war's terrible harvest. The memory stone stood in the place of honor beside the great hall's entrance, its surface carved with the kind of intricate runework that would take a master craftsman weeks to complete. Unlike the rough memorial stones that marked the graves of the fallen, this new monument had been shaped with love and reverence, its every line designed to tell a story that would endure long after those who had lived it were nothing but names whispered by the wind. 3 months had passed since the battle in the Eastern Valley. 3 months of healing and rebuilding that had transformed not just the settlement of Brundal, but the lives of everyone who called it home. The snow had melted with the coming of spring, revealing green grass where blood had once stained the earth, and wildflowers had begun to bloom in the places where brave men had fallen, defending what they held most dear. Ingrid's health had returned with the warming weather. The last traces of Harald's poison finally purged from her system by the skilled healer Einar had brought from the southern settlements. She stood now in her garden, her hands once again dark with honest earth as she tended the herbs that would flavor their food and heal their hurts. The sight of her kneeling among the growing things filled Stigvard with the kind of quiet contentment that comes only after surviving storms you were not sure you could weather. The delegation from Jarl Henrik's lands arrived this morning, Einar reported, approaching through the garden paths with the easy stride of a man who no longer carried the weight of shame on his shoulders. They bring formal recognition of our alliance and an invitation to the summer gathering of the northern Jarls. Good, Stigvard replied, though his attention remained focused on the memory stone. It's time the other settlements understood that Brundal stands not alone, but as part of something larger. What we've built here, this alliance between our bloodlines, it could change how leadership works throughout the region. The stone told that story in symbols older than written words, in the flowing lines of knotwork that bound the raven of Einar's heritage to the bear of Stigvard's lineage. At the base, smaller figures represented the people of both settlements, no longer subjects serving distant lords, but members of an extended family whose welfare was the sacred duty of those who led them. In the weeks following the battle, Einar had reclaimed his birthright as Jarl of the Eastern Fjords, but he had done so in a way that honored both his heritage and his hard-won wisdom. Instead of ruling from the old stronghold where his grandfather had held court, he had chosen to rebuild closer to Brundal, creating a new settlement that would serve as both a symbol of renewal and a practical alliance between neighboring peoples. The surviving members of Gunnar's war band had been offered a choice: exile to distant lands where their shame could not follow them, or the opportunity to prove their worth through honest labor and faithful service to the communities they had once tried to destroy. Most had chosen the harder path of redemption, and many had already begun to earn the trust of people who had learned that mercy could be stronger than vengeance. "The memorial service is ready," Magnus the Elder announced, his weathered hands carrying the ceremonial horn that would be filled with mead for the ritual toast to the fallen. "The families have gathered and the words have been prepared." They assembled in the growing dusk, as was traditional for honoring the dead. Warriors and farmers, mothers and children, elders whose memories stretched back to the founding of the settlement, and young people who would carry its stories into an uncertain future. Each held a small candle made from beeswax and blessed by the old rites, their flickering flames creating points of light in the gathering darkness. Stigvard spoke first, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd as he recited the names of those who had died, defending their homes and families. Each name was answered by the unified voice of the community, speaking the traditional response. "We remember." The words created a rhythm like heartbeats, like the eternal pulse of life, continuing in the face of loss. Then Einar stepped forward, the raven banner draped across his shoulders like a royal cloak, and spoke the words that would bind the past to the future in chains stronger than blood or gold. Today we honor not just the fallen, but the living who chose to stand with them. We remember not just the battle, but the bonds forged in its fire. This stone will tell our children and their children that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what is right, despite that fear. It will remind them that true strength lies not in the power to destroy, but in the wisdom to build. As the ceremony concluded and the gathered families began to disperse to their evening meals, Stigvard found himself standing alone before the memory stone with his mother and his blood brother. The candlelight played across the carved runes, making them seem to dance with life and purpose. "Your father would be proud," Ingrid said quietly, her hand resting on Stigvard's shoulder with the gentle weight of a lifetime's love and guidance, not just of the victory, but of how it was won. Mercy seasoned with justice, strength tempered by wisdom. These are the qualities that make legends worth telling. "The stone is beautiful," Einar added, tracing one of the carved ravens with his fingertip. "But the real memorial is what we've built together. A community that proved honor is stronger than hatred, that brotherhood can overcome betrayal." As they walked back toward the warm light spilling from the great hall's windows, Stigvard reflected on how much had changed since that snowy afternoon when he had first seen his mother sharing her warmth with a broken stranger. The stranger had proven to be family. The broken man had revealed himself as a natural leader, and the simple act of kindness had grown into something that would reshape the lives of generations yet unborn. Behind them, the memory stone stood sentinel in the gathering dusk, its carved surface holding the stories they had lived and the promises they had made. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as all tomorrows do. But tonight there was peace in the knowledge that some things honor family. The bonds forged in love and tested by adversity endure long after the storms have passed and the heroes have become legends carved in stone.